Patagonia was named after the mythical giants that early European explorers believed roamed its shores. In 1520, Magellan's crew met people on this coast and swore they were giants. They called the local Tehuelche people Patagones, and the land Patagonia, a name that has stuck for over 500 years. Sitting at the southern tip of South America, it still guards more mystery than most places on Earth. It's hard to grasp just how vast and varied Patagonia really is. It stretches from the ice fields and granite peaks of the Andes to the rugged Atlantic coast. In the west, glacier carve through fjords and temperate rainforest. Head east, and the land flattens into desert steppe, swept by wind that can gust past 100 kilometers an hour. Between those two extremes lies the largest ice mass in the southern hemisphere outside Antarctica itself. This is a land shaped as much by myth as by geology, and it's still being explored. Blue is the first word for this place. Not green, not white, but blue, because Paine itself means blue in the language of the people who lived here first. The range at the heart of the park rises straight out of Patagonian steppe with no foothills to soften the approach. Every one of those granite spires, the towers and the horns beside them, came from the same slow event, a pocket of magma that pushed up under this ground about 12.5 million years ago and never quite broke the surface. It hardened in place, layer stacked on layer, and the mountains had to wait millions of years for ice and weather to carve away everything that wasn't stone. What's left is a wall of pale granite capped in dark, older rock, the two colors marking exactly where the melted rock stopped and the cooked stone began. Below it, glaciers carry on the same unfinished work. Gray Glacier alone runs 28 kilometers down from the ice field behind the range, and by the time it reaches the lake, it has already split into separate fronts of blue-white ice. That ice field feeding it is the second largest outside the polar regions, a reserve of frozen water most visitors never see beyond its edge. Everything it grinds down ends up suspended in the lakes as fine rock flour, which is the real reason the water below the peaks runs turquoise instead of clear. Roads and footbridges thread along the shorelines now, but they only trace the edges of something built on a much older schedule. Condensation, calving, erosion. The range keeps changing shape, just slowly enough that no single visit ever catches it in the act. Torres del Paine was set aside as a national park in 1959, protecting mountains that's still being unmade, one glacier at a time. Before we head to the next spot, here's a fun question. What can you see at Punta Tombo? Comment your answer. At the southern tip of Argentina, where the Andes finally run out of mountain, the city of Ushuaia sits below the 54th parallel south. It's widely recognized as the southernmost city in the world. The town spreads along a wide bay on Isla Grande de Tierra del Fuego, with the Marshall Mountain Range rising directly behind it. One road gets you in, cut through the Sierra Alvear and over Garibaldi Pass, making Ushuaia the only city in Argentina reached by crossing part of the Andes. Colorful rooftops and a red brick church mark the historic center, founded in 1884 by Naval Commander Augusto Lacerre. The name itself comes from the Yagan language, Ush and Waya, meaning deep bay. Sailboats and fishing vessels fill the harbor beneath the mountains, in waters once tied to the region's whaling trade. A red train, originally built by prisoners from the local penal colony, still runs today, the southernmost railway on the planet. Just offshore, a red and white lighthouse marks a scatter of islets in the Beagle Channel, standing since 1920. Cruise ships and expedition vessels line the port too, because Ushuaia's pier is one of the world's main departure points for Antarctica, roughly 1,100 kilometers south. It's one of only 5 cities anywhere formally recognized as an Antarctic gateway. Around 82,000 people live here now, at the last stretch of road before the mountains give way to open water. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing destinations and unforgettable journeys. Most glaciers on the planet are dying quietly. This one refuses to. Its ice front runs close to 5 kilometers wide, rising as much as 60 meters above the surface of Lago Argentino. All of it flows down from the southern Patagonian ice field, the third largest reserve of fresh water outside the polar regions. Up close, the wall isn't smooth. It's split into deep blue crevasses, edges sharp enough to look carved rather than grown. That blue isn't paint or reflection. It's what's left after centuries of pressure crush the air out of the ice, absorbing every color of light except one. Ancient light still escaping. Every few years, the glacier does something almost no other ice on Earth still does. It grows far enough to seal off part of the lake beside it, until the water pressure builds and the whole dam ruptures at once. What's left afterward drifts loose across the surface, chunks the size of houses broken free from a wall that was solid a moment before. Around it all, Lenga forest turns rust red each autumn, the one thing here that actually changes with the seasons. Unlike most glaciers in the region, Perito Moreno's mass has stayed remarkably steady for decades, and it shows in the sheer amount of ice still standing. Declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1981, it's one of the few glaciers left that visitors still call unforgettable. We worked really hard to make these videos, and of course, your support is a huge motivation. If you love us, you can scan the QR code here to buy us a cup of coffee. Granite this sharp isn't supposed to exist above tree line. Fitz Roy rises straight out of the Patagonian steppe, a wall of granite needles breaking into open sky. Long before it was Fitz Roy, this mountain had another name. The Tehuelche people called it Chaltén, meaning smoking mountain, because a cloud almost always sits on the summit. That cloud isn't weather passing through. It's near constant, driven off the ice field to the west and pinned against the rock. Down in the valley, the town of El Chaltén didn't even exist until 1985, built more to hold the land than to house anyone. It's since become Argentina's trekking capital, though the mountain above it hasn't gotten any easier to reach. The name Fitz Roy came later, in 1877, honoring the British captain, Robert Fitz Roy, who had charted this coastline decades earlier from the deck of the Beagle. It took until 1952 for the summit to actually be reached, by a French expedition working up the southeast ridge. Even in the short summer season, the peak can vanish into cloud for weeks before it lets anyone near it. Then, for a few minutes at sunrise, the hostility turns to color, and the granite burns orange before the sky around it does. Glaciers pour off its flanks in every direction, spilling toward turquoise lakes and a valley that turns gold and red in autumn. At 3,405 meters, Fitz Roy isn't especially tall by world standards. It's just hard enough to still be mostly unclimbed, mostly unbothered. I'm curious, what time is it where you're watching from? And which country are you joining me from today? At the southern tip of Argentina, where Route 3 finally runs out, Tierra del Fuego National Park waits at the edge of the continent. It's Argentina's southernmost national park, and the only one where the sea reaches this far in, the Beagle Channel forming its southern edge, with the Cordillera Darwin rising behind. Established in 1960, it was the country's first national park built along a coastline, spread across 630 square kilometers of forest, lake, and mountain. Lake Fagnano marks the park's northern boundary. Inside, the quieter waters of Lake Roca sit ringed by beech forest, with the Andes just beyond. Elsewhere, smaller lakes turn an improbable turquoise, fed by meltwater from the peaks around them. Antarctic beech, lenga, and koihui cover the lower slopes, gold and rust before the first real snow. Then winter takes over, and roads, wetlands, and forest floor all disappear under one continuous white reaching up to the ridgelines. Not every tree here made it through. Stands of bare, dead lenga still stand in shallow water, drowned after beavers, brought in during the 1940s for their fur, dammed the rivers and stayed. Close to 90 bird species have been recorded in the park, among them the upland goose and the red-headed Magellanic woodpecker. Wooden boardwalks cross the peat bogs, keeping visitors above ground that never fully dries. Ask around Ushuaia, and someone will eventually tell you, if it's not snowing, don't go. The park earns its reputation under fresh snow. Nice, certainly. Wild without question. But whether Tierra del Fuego lives up to its reputation depends almost entirely on the weather the day you show up. Valdés Peninsula was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1999, protecting one of the most important marine mammal sanctuaries on the planet. A narrow strip of land, the Carlos Ameghino Isthmus, is the only thing tying this outcrop to the mainland. From above, it spreads across some 360,000 hectares of dry steppe meeting open Atlantic on nearly every side. Its lowest point sits 131 feet below sea level, one of the deepest depressions on the continent, though nothing in the view above hints at it. Sand gives way to turquoise shallows and green tidal flats in the gulfs, water pooling and retreating in patterns that shift with every tide. And the tide here matters more than almost anywhere else on this coast. Sea levels can swing as much as 6 meters between a spring high and a spring low. Timing decides what you actually get to see. At low tide, the water pulls back for what feels like miles, leaving wide, flat, empty beaches. At high tide, the same shoreline closes in, and it's no accident that orcas move closest to shore right then. Southern right whales pass through these gulfs from June to December, a narrow window outside of which the water can look deceptively still and empty. Along the coast, Magellanic penguins nest by the thousands, close to 40,000 pairs spread across 5 separate colonies on this shoreline. Pale cliffs, worn soft by wind and tide, shelter nesting seabirds above sea lion colonies below, while guanaco and armadillo move through the scrub just inland. Puerto Madryn is protected by the Golfo Nuevo, which is formed by Peninsula Valdés and Punta Ninfas, and is one of the most sheltered places on the Patagonian coast. From above, the city spreads out in a tight grid along the water, backed by open, empty steppe instead of hills. Magellan sailed past in 1520 and named it Bahia Sin Fondo, the Bottomless Bay, long before it had any other name. That changed in 1865 when around 150 Welsh immigrants landed here aboard the ship Mimosa and named the port Madryn, after a family estate back in Wales. The coastline slopes so gently that piers here have to stretch far out just to reach water deep enough for a ship to dock. Along the shore, pale cliffs rise in layers, cut slowly by wind and tide into shapes that shift with the light. At low tide, the sea pulls back and leaves wide flats of sand and seaweed, reaching almost to the horizon. Small boats sit anchored just offshore, barely moving, proof of how calm the Gulf stays even when the open Atlantic beyond it is not. Past the edge of the city, the land turns dry and flat, the beginning of the Patagonian steppe that stretches for miles inland. From May to December, southern right whales move into these sheltered waters, close enough to the coast to be seen from the cliffs above. Around 103,000 people live here now, in a city that started as a handful of families stepping off a ship onto an empty shore. Desert on one side, ocean on the other, and a calm gulf holding the two apart. That's Puerto Madryn. Down here, the Andes don't stay in the background. They lean straight into the city. Bariloche sits on the southern shore of Nahuel Huapi Lake, a glacial giant whose shoreline twists into peninsulas, bays, and islands instead of running in a straight line. Around it, 7,000 square kilometers of national park, Argentina's oldest, climb from lake level into raw granite peaks. At the water's edge, the Civic Center looks like it drifted in from the Alps, cypress beams, green stone cut from a mountain 13 million years old, a clock tower where wooden figures still step out at noon. Nearby, the cathedral rises in white stone, its Gothic spire built as a Latin cross facing the sunrise. Snow, then stone, then water. The pattern repeats, block by block. A short drive out of town, the land folds upward into Cerro Catedral, where ski runs spread across 600 hectares, the largest stretch of skiable terrain anywhere in South America. From the base at just over 1,000 meters, the lifts climb toward twin granite spires that gave the mountain its name. Further along the lake, a wooded peninsula holds the Lau Lau, a hotel that burned to the ground within 2 years of opening in 1938, then came back, wing by wing, on the same site. Roads wind through forest and snowfields to reach it, lake on one side, mountain on the other. Every angle here repeats the same trade, water below, rock above, and a thin strip of forest holding the two apart. Bariloche was built to look like somewhere else, and somehow the Andes let it. Locals here have a saying for this valley, a landscape painted by God. The town sits where two valleys meet, the Espolón and the Futaleufú, just 10 kilometers from the Argentine border. About 2,000 people live here, their rooftops laid out in a grid beneath the peaks. Above them, the Andes rise sharp, snow still clinging to the highest ridges. Below, the river that gave the town its name cuts through the valley floor, a blue too vivid to look real from above. Futaleufú means big river in the Mapuche language, and out here, the name isn't an exaggeration. Its gorge drops as much as 1,700 meters below the glaciated peaks pressing in on either side. The river begins far upstream, fed by glacial meltwater inside Los Alerces National Park, a UNESCO-protected wilderness just across the border in Argentina. Further down, it slows into open lakes, still enough to mirror the mountains that feed them. Then it turns wild again, breaking into whitewater regarded as some of the best in the world. Between the rapids, the valley opens into quiet farmland, pastures, rows of poplars, fences tracing the curve of the water. Eventually, it empties into Yelcho Lake and continues on as the Rio Yelcho, carrying this valley's color all the way to the Pacific. If you've visited this place before, comment 1. If you haven't, comment 2. This is the narrow stretch of water separating the mainland of South America from its last scraps of land before Antarctica. The Beagle Channel runs about 150 miles through Tierra del Fuego, and in places it narrows to barely 3 miles across. Forested islands crowd its edges, and behind them the Andes drop straight into the sea. It takes its name from a British survey ship, the same one that carried a young Charles Darwin south in the 1830s. He first saw the glaciers here in January of 1833 and wrote that their color was a beryl blue he'd never seen before, set against the white of the snow. Those glaciers are still calving today, sliding down from the Darwin ice field through the stretch sailors call Glacier Alley. Five of them are named after European countries: Holland, Italy, France, Germany, Spain, an old habit of explorers naming ice after home. Near Ushuaia, the world's southernmost city, a red and white lighthouse stands alone on a rock in the channel. It's barely 11 meters tall, built back in 1920, and it's become the one image most people carry home from here. Cormorants and sea lions crowd the islets around its base, and further out, penguins work their way along the gravel beaches. Not everyone comes away moved. Some call it 2 noisy hours on a crowded boat for a lighthouse and a handful of birds, nothing more. But the channel isn't performing for anyone. It's been cutting this same quiet path between two oceans since long before anyone was watching. This information was compiled from multiple sources. If there are any inaccuracies, please share your suggestions in the comments below. El Chaltén is Argentina's youngest town, founded in 1985 in the far north of Santa Cruz province, right at the foot of the Andes. It began as a border settlement, planted here to secure Argentina's claim to this stretch of Patagonia. The trekking reputation came later. The town sits where the Rio de las Vueltas meets the Rio Fitz Roy, in a valley walled in by mountains on every side. Above it, the granite spires of Fitz Roy climb to 3,405 meters, rarely fully clear of cloud. Beside it stands Cerro Torre, another needle of granite reaching 3,128 meters into the sky. The last stretch of road crosses miles of open steppe, gold and empty, before the mountains take over completely. Barely 2,000 people live here, 220 kilometers from the nearest town of any size. West of town, the Viedma Glacier spreads across the ice field, the largest glacier in Argentina. That ice field is the southern Patagonian ice field, the second largest stretch of contiguous ice outside Antarctica. Snow here doesn't pass through. It settles in for months, covering road and riverbank alike. The water changes with the seasons too, turquoise and fast in summer, locked white and still by winter. All of it lies inside Los Glaciares National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1981. A town that didn't exist 40 years ago is now called the trekking capital of the world. It's the largest lake in Argentina, and for most of its shoreline, there's nobody around to see it. Lago Argentino covers 1,415 square kilometers of Patagonia, fed by the La Leona River and by glaciers pouring in from the west. Its shoreline winds for nearly 687 kilometers, curling around bays and glacial arms that reach deep into the mountains. At its deepest point, near the arm that faces the Uppsala Glacier, it drops more than 700 meters below the surface, one of the deepest lakes on the continent. Icebergs break off in silence and drift for days before the current finally takes them apart. The Uppsala Glacier feeds the lake through its own channel, and it has been retreating since it was first documented back in 1810. Further south, the Perito Moreno Glacier reaches the water in slow arms of blue and white ice. Together with the Uppsala, it's part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, designated in 1981, where glaciers cover close to half the protected land. El Calafate sits quietly along part of the shore, the only real settlement on a lake this size. From above, the water shifts from deep navy to a pale glacial turquoise, depending on how the light falls. And yet for most of its length, there's nothing built along the water at all. No promenade, no place made for people to sit with the view. Just open shoreline and one nature reserve for the birds, expensive to enter and easy to miss. It's the kind of place that seems designed for silence rather than visitors. Lago Argentino doesn't perform for anyone. It just sits at the foot of the mountains, doing what it's done since the ice carved it. Somewhere in Patagonia, a lake decided ordinary blue wasn't good enough, so it made its own. General Carrera Lake glows an impossible turquoise, the result of fine glacial rock flour bending light back in shades of blue and green. It's the largest lake in Chile, straddling across nearly 1,850 square kilometers. Cliffs and forested ridges drop straight into the water, carved by glaciers that once filled this entire basin, with the snow-covered Andes still standing guard above it. Below the surface, it plunges fast, down to 586 meters at its deepest point, fed by rivers running off the mountains and eventually draining west into the Baker River. The Ayanakenk people called it Chalenco, stormy waters, a name the lake still earns when wind rolls off the peaks. But the real signature of this place sits along its shoreline, the marble caves. What's now smooth, swirling marble started out as ordinary limestone, buried more than 10 kilometers underground and slowly cooked at nearly 300 degrees Celsius. Then the lake took over where the heat left off. For roughly 6,000 years, waves have worn that stone into caverns, arches, and columns, polishing every wall they touch. The largest of these formations even have names of their own: the Marble Cathedral and the Marble Chapel, each one shaped by the same patient water. Light bounces off the lake and back onto the marble, so the caves shift color with the season, pale one month, deep blue the next. Step inside, and the walls curve overhead like something built on purpose, though nothing here was ever built at all. It's a lake that never stopped shaping the rock around it. Punta Arenas is the southernmost large city on Earth. It sits on the Strait of Magellan, where the Pacific finally meets the Atlantic. Founded in 1848 as little more than a penal outpost meant to hold the strait for Chile, it grew on gold and sheep, filled out by Croatian and Russian settlers chasing both. Ships still line up at its docks, because this city is still what it always was: a waypoint, the last real stop before Antarctica. 200 miles north, the water turns turquoise and the land stops pretending to be flat. Torres del Paine's granite towers rise and double themselves in a lake, still enough to hold their reflection. Out past the last gravel road, icebergs drift quietly in water that never really warms. The light here doesn't so much set as linger, like it isn't sure it wants to leave either. Puerto Natales looks small from above, but it holds a strange position, the last town before the wilderness truly begins. It was founded in 1911 on a narrow strip of shore where the Señoret Channel meets the sea. To the south, that channel opens into the Gulf of Almirante Montt. To the northwest, it narrows into the Ultima Esperanza Sound, Last Hope Sound, named by a Spanish navigator who was running out of routes to the Strait of Magellan and refused to give up on one more. That name still fits. Snow still sits on the peaks above the water most of the year, even when the town below is clear and calm. Just outside the center, the old wooden pier stands alone in the channel, its posts worn down to driftwood, a leftover from a working port that once moved more than it does now. A few kilometers on, the weathered brick buildings of Puerto Boris hold a different memory, a cold storage plant built in 1915 when this coastline shipped meat and wool to Europe and the town grew up around the work. Inland, the steppe turns to open road and bare rock, wind carved into shapes that look older than the land around them. This is also where the routes into Torres del Paine begin, and the glaciers of the southern Patagonian ice field aren't far behind the horizon. Some days the sky over the water turns the color of the mountains, gray folding into blue, folding into gray again. Other days it breaks into a rainbow over the rooftops, gone before anyone can point at it. Puerto Natales was never meant to be the destination. It's the last stop before the wild part starts. This is a town most people pass through on the way to something else, but it earns a longer look. Just beyond the rooftops, the water lies calm and glassy, the ice visible on the horizon. Same lake, different light every hour, silver at midday, gold when the sun drops low over the water. El Calafate takes its name from the Calafate bush that once grew wild along this ground. Yellow flowers, dark blue berries, and an old promise: eat one and you're bound to return. Declared a town on December 7, 1927, it started as little more than a wagon stop on the road to the ice. What began as a handful of families has spread for miles along the southern shore, rooftops dusted white in winter, gold with poplar leaves once autumn comes. Streets lined with tall poplars lead down toward the water, the trees changing with the season, the way the rest of the town seems to. Out past the last buildings, the lakeshore turns to salt white flats where Chilean flamingos gather in the shallows. The water so shallow it barely covers the ground. Beyond that, the land turns dry and open, flat-topped mesas, a straight gravel road cutting through the scrub for miles with nothing else in sight. It's steppe wild enough for guanaco herds to call home, the kind of open ground that stretches on longer than it looks from above. Ice at one edge, open steppe at the other, El Calafate sits right in between, holding both landscapes at once. What began as a wagon stop for wool traders a century ago is now the gateway town to this stretch of Patagonia's ice country, still small enough to walk end to end, still growing at the edge of the glacier. A town this orderly wasn't planned as a resort, it was planned as a border post. San Martín de los Andes was founded in 1898, when a military expedition settled the shore of Lake Lácar to hold this ground for Argentina during a dispute with Chile. That's why the streets still run in a straight, deliberate grid down to the water, a layout built for defense, not for postcards. The lake itself breaks the rule you'd expect of Patagonia. Most of these glacial lakes empty east into the Atlantic, but Lácar drains west toward the Pacific. For decades, the economy here ran on timber, the surrounding slopes stripped and sawn long before anyone thought to ski them. That changed in 1937, when Lanín National Park was created around the town, protecting some 412,000 hectares of Andean Patagonian forest. Logging gave way to tourism, and the wood that once built sawmills went into the chalets and shingle roofs that still define the town's alpine look. Its white bell tower rises above those rooftops, a fixed point in a landscape that otherwise keeps shifting with the season. By afternoon, the light climbs the ridgelines above the houses, catching the treetops in gold before it drops into the valley. Higher up, on Cerro Chapulco, the forest gives way to open snowfields that hold skiable terrain up to nearly 2,000 meters. On the water, sailboats sit anchored off a shoreline that's calm enough on the right morning to double every island and every peak in reflection. From here, the road south threads past lake after lake, the start of what's known simply as the Route of the Seven Lakes. Deep in Tierra del Fuego, in the Tierra Mayor Valley, a trail that starts 18 kilometers outside Ushuaia leads to a color that doesn't belong here. Outside the boundaries of the national park, it's the most popular hike near the city, and once the water comes into view, it's easy to understand why. Laguna Esmeralda sits surrounded by gray rock and dense green forest, and somehow neither one explains the water. That color comes from sediment carried down from the Ojo del Albino Glacier, hanging in the mountains above. It changes with the light. One moment it's turquoise, the next a pale, milky jade. To reach it, the land first passes through a forest of lenga, the native beech that covers this part of Patagonia. Then the trees give way to bog. Peat stretches out beneath the peaks, soft ground built up over time before it ever meets the water. Streams cut down from the glacier, threading through gravel flats before spilling into the lagoon. The trail itself doesn't end at the shoreline. It keeps going along the tributary, the ground turning steeper and more technical as it climbs toward the glacier itself. Around it all, the Sierra Alvear rises sharp and streaked with snow, sealing the valley off from everything else. Clouds sit low here, catching on the ridgelines instead of drifting past them. The whole basin lies inside the Tierra Mayor Nature Reserve, protected simply for how it looks. Snow still holds on the peaks above Trevelin, even as the valley floor turns green below. This is the Valley 16 de Octubre, a strip of fertile land tucked into Chubut province, at the western edge of Argentine Patagonia. The name itself comes from Welsh, tre for town, velin for mill, after the flour mill Welsh settlers built here in the late 1800s. Streets fan out from small rotondas, tree-lined and unhurried, following a grid laid out generations ago. Farm country starts right where the town ends. Fields stretch out in even rows, dark soil freshly turned, framed by poplar windbreaks and the mountains behind them. A lake near town holds the peaks in near-perfect reflection, still enough to double the sky. Wetlands nearby do the same trick, clouds mirrored so cleanly the horizon nearly disappears. Pastureland runs along the water's edge, fed by streams coming straight off the Andes. When spring arrives, Campo de Tulipanes bursts into bloom. Rows of tulips spread out in red, orange, and yellow, drawing thousands of visitors every year since was first planted in 1996. Locals call Trevelin the Garden of the Province. Same valley, same snowline in the distance, and for a few weeks a year, it blooms in color instead of grain. Two mountains stand together at the edge of the Patagonian ice. Fitz Roy rises to the east, broad-shouldered and blunt. Just west of it, Cerro Torre answers with something sharper. A granite spike climbing to 3,128 meters, less a mountain than a blade pointed straight up. It rises off the edge of the southern Patagonian ice field, the world's second largest stretch of ice outside the polar regions, a mass so vast it feeds the glaciers on every side of these peaks. Cerro Torre doesn't stand alone either. It's the tallest of four towers in a row, with Torre Egger beside it at 2,685 meters, and Punta Herón and Cerro Standhart continuing the line like teeth on a ridge. What sets it apart from everything else out here is what sits on top. Wind hits this summit with a force close to 100 knots, constant enough to coat the rock in a shell of fragile rime ice. Over time, that wind builds the ice into a mushroom shape on the very top, reshaped by every storm that rolls through. Even climbers who fight their way up the granite still have that frozen cap waiting above them, unclimbed in any conventional sense. Below the peak, meltwater gathers into Laguna Torre, fed by the Grande Glacier, its shoreline littered with icebergs that break loose from the glacier's face. These towers face west, so for most of the day they sit in their own shadow. Only at sunrise does the light finally clear the ridge and reach the granite, turning gray stone gold for a few short minutes before it fades again. Down in the valley, the small town of El Chaltén watches all of this from below, a settlement built almost entirely around getting people close enough to see it. But it took until 1974 for anyone to stand on Cerro Torre's true summit. For 1,240 kilometers, this road refuses to settle into one landscape. It cuts through Chile's Los Lagos and Aysén regions, two of the country's emptiest corners. Some stretches open onto pale, cracked lake beds, bleached white and abandoned by the water that once filled them. Others drop the road into dense native forest, asphalt cutting a straight, narrow line between walls of trees. Then the trees give way, and the road turns to gravel, climbing through open scrubland under snow-capped peaks. Rivers here run an impossible turquoise, braiding across gravel flats before the road catches up with them again. Despite its length, the highway reaches only around 100,000 people, small villages pressed against pale, milky lakes, connected by little more than a dock and a dirt track. Three separate ferry crossings still break the route, carrying vehicles over water the road itself was never able to bridge. Built in pieces through the 1980s and 90s, the final stretch to Villa O'Higgins wasn't finished until the year 2000. Guanacos roam this land in herds that stretch to the horizon. Whales, penguins, and elephant seals crowd its coastlines in numbers few other places on Earth can match. This is the farthest south the world gets before the ice takes over closer to Antarctica than any other continent, separated only by 1,000 kilometers of open water. Patagonia doesn't really end, it just runs out of land. Whatever brought you here, this is a place built to be returned to.